Engrossed Senate Bill 2368 with House amendments, introduced by Senator Miller and other House and Senate sponsors. Engrossed Senate Bill 2368 is a bill for an act to create and enact a new section to Chapter 14-02.1 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to limitations on and penalties for performing an abortion, to amend and reenact Sections 14-02.1, -02, -07, and 14.02-03-01 and 14.02-03-02 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to definitions, reporting requirements, and the use of public funds for abortion and family planning. Mr. Speaker, your Human Services Committee recommends amendments which are passed on the previous sixth order. When so amended, recommends do pass on Senate Bill 2368 with House amendments by a vote of 10 yeas, 3 nays, 0 absent, and 0 not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Silbernagel.
Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, your Committee on Human Services recommend a due pass of engrossed Senate Bill 2368 by a vote of 10 ayes and 3 nays. As already described by our Chief Clerk, this bill relates to performing abortions in our state. Senate Bill 2368 focuses on 3 main areas of the change in our Century Code of North Dakota. It seeks to strengthen and to clarify. First, it sets forward certain limitations for performing abortions. Second, it addresses certain definitions and reporting requirements. Third, it clarifies the use of public funds in this regard. If you would follow along on your computers, I'll point out the significant changes that this has on North Dakota's abortion-related Century Code. On page 2, line 8, fertilization is defined and means the fusion of a human spermatozoon with a human ovum. Subsection 10 on page 3 spells out the requirement to determine the post-fertilization age of the fetus. Subsection 12 on page 4 defines the post-fertilization age as the age of the unborn child calculated from fertilization. Subsection 14 on page 4 includes the reasonable medical judgment language in determining the post-fertilization age. Section 2 on page 4 and 5 is a new section of code and prohibits the abortion of an unborn child of 20 weeks or more of post-fertilization age, except in the case of a medical emergency. The new language in Section 3 on pages 5, 6, and 7 further define the reporting requirements of all abortions performed. The new language added to the Century Code spells out the reporting requirements related to determining the post-fertilization age in an emergency, and if the age of the unborn child is determined to be 20 or more weeks and an abortion is performed. Additions to subsection 3 on page 8 state, also, no such funds may be used to contract with or provide financial or other support to individuals, organizations, or entities performing, inducing, referring for, or counseling in favor of abortions. Section 4 on pages 7 and 8 clarifies the use of public funds, and subsection 3 clearly states that unless an abortion is necessary to prevent the death of the woman, no state, local, or federal funds may be used to pay for the abortion, and no funds may be used to contract with individuals, organizations, or entities performing, inducing, referring for, or counseling in favor of abortions. Lastly, on Section 5, page 8, it clarifies the use of public funds for family planning, as we discussed yesterday. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, we heard extended testimony on this bill in our committee hearing, and we had significant debate in our committee action session. The final vote by your Human Services Committee was a due pass recommendation by a 10-3 margin, and I respectfully request that this Assembly would also do the same.
Is there any discussion? Representative Mooney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Silbernagel, would you yield to a question?
Mr. Speaker, I would.
Representative Mooney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Silbernagel, my question is, are there exceptions in the case of rape, incest, or fetal fatal conditions anywhere in the language?
Mr. Speaker, Representative, there is no specific language that addresses that in this bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Boucher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Silvernagle, would you yield to another question?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Boucher.
Thank you. Representative Silvernagle, on February 14th, our Attorney General ruled that North Dakota Century Code 14-02.3-02 in its entirety was invalidated and unconstitutional. So in other words, Section 5 of this legislation of the code is, quote, invalidated in its entirety. Can you explain how this legislation now is enforceable under federal law?
Mr. Speaker, Representative, this legislation is forward-looking. What has happened in the past is not addressed. This is not retroactive in nature. This bill is forward-looking and affects future actions.
May I continue?
You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My concern with this is once again the fact that our Attorney General has already determined that this section of code is unenforceable and unconstitutional. And so by further amending it, we don't do anything to make it any more constitutional. So therefore, it's unenforceable by either state or federal authorities. So I ask that people vote no on 2368.
Is there further discussion? Representative Guggisberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Silvernagle, would you yield to another question?
Yes, I will.
Representative Guggisberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Silvernagle. My question has to do with medical emergencies and the time it would take for the doctor to first determine whether it was a medical emergency, and then after that, the post-fertilization age of the fetus, and what would be the impact to the positive outcome of that patient, just because of the time it would take.
Mr. Speaker, Representative, in the medical field, there are standard protocol and best practices that are deployed, and I would expect that those practices would be deployed in this particular case as well.
May I continue, Mr. Speaker?
You may continue.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, I realize that there are best practices in the medical field. This changes that, and this puts into law what the doctors have to do before they can look out for the best interests of their patients.
Is there further discussion? Representative M. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Silvernagle, would you yield to another question?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. On page 4, on lines 22 through 25, it talks about abortion after 20 weeks of post-fertilization, and then also speaks of the compelling interest being from the time the child is capable of feeling pain. This seems to be a great inconsistency to me, because I was not aware of good meta-analysis or anything that spoke of feeling pain as a consensus in any way in the scientific literature before 30 weeks of age. So did the committee receive good meta-analysis of scientific literature that showed children do, in fact, feel pain at 20 weeks of age?
Representative Silvernagle.
Mr. Speaker, Representative, yes, we heard considerable testimony in our hearing regarding pain at 20 weeks and even prior to 20 weeks. And I think that testimony will be documented in our committee hearing, and it's all there and it's available.
If I may continue.
You may continue.
Members of the Assembly, there's really no question necessarily that children feel something. You can demonstrate that. But there really is no scientific consensus that children can feel age before 30 weeks of age. And what that does is it really renders this whole bill indefensible. Now, I voted for the heartbeat bill. I don't have a trouble with the 20 weeks. I have trouble with a bill that makes no sense. This is not scientific. This is not defensible. And so let's eliminate this instead of creating a lot of work for our Attorney General. Well, it probably won't be a lot of work. It'll go away so fast that we won't probably even see it. But this is not a question of protecting the children, but this is simply a question that this is factually and indefensibly wrong. It's incorrect. So let's vote red on this.
Is there further discussion? Representative Grandy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. The Attorney General did not rule anything or nor deem it unconstitutional. He stated that, it was not merely acceptable in this particular piece and needed correction, that it was 40 years old and needed to be updated, and this is what that amendment does, is updates that language. It was not a ruling of unconstitutional. In the post-fertilization, those dates are established by the definitions that the representative went through you section by section when he addressed the bill. I appreciate the fact that in this discussion we have been willing to say that this is a child. Thank you for using that proper language. And I ask that we do pass this because we do have the advancements in medical field to prove this. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier yield to another question?
Representative Silbernagel, would you yield to another question?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I would.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Silbernagel, in the case where there would be an inadequate report with an abortion procedure, as I understand the bill, do you know where the liability would fall on that healthcare provider, on that clinical facility?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not an expert on the reporting requirements of current Century Code, but expectations are the liability would follow current Century Code.
All right, thank you. And then I did have one follow-up question, if I may continue, Mr. Speaker.
You may proceed.
Representative Silbernagel, in the case that any of this would be turned over to the Attorney General, do they have staff there or in the Health Department currently processing these reports?
Representative Silbernagel.
Mr. Speaker and Representative, I'm being told that yes, they do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Gruchella.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Silbernagel, will you yield to another question?
Mr. Speaker, yes, it would.
Representative Gruchella.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Silbernagel, I'm wondering about the practical application of this bill. If it is indeed a criminal violation, who signs the warrant? Who takes out the complaint? And do you arrest the doctor, the mother, the nurses, or the hospital, or how's this going to work?
Mr. Speaker, Representative, again, there are processes, procedures in place to address current Century Code, and I would expect the processes to follow what is in statute.
Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the House has before it for final consideration Senate Bill 2368. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Key will be closed and clerk will take the record. The final record shows 60 yea, 32 nay, 2 absent, not voting. Senate Bill 2368 is declared passed. Continuing on the 14th order of business, the House has before it Senate Concurrent Resolution 4009, which has been read. Mr. Chief Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, engrossed Senate Concurrent Resolution